So this morning, we have a very, very special speaker with us to close out the Conference of Revive and to be Mission Gathering San Diego's special speaker this morning. Now, Brandon Roberson is your lead pastor. You're loving Brandon? He's doing good. And all the greatness of Brandon and the wisdom of Brandon, he has mentors. And I'm telling you, his strongest mentor is here today. We are honored to have her be a part of this church and now the Mission Gathering movement, the Disciples of Christ. Because if it wasn't for her, I don't know if Brandon would be the man that he is today, honestly. Paula served as a leader in a international church planting organization that probably planted more churches than any other organization in the world, okay? She knows her stuff. But more importantly, she invests in so many people's lives. And so through that, in her planting of churches, in her journey, God is doing so much through her story. And this morning, we get to hear her story and her journey and her love for Jesus. Would you please welcome to Mission Gathering San Diego, Paula Williams.
So it was the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus had just completed 8 mini parables. He was ready to head back across the Sea of Galilee. He got in the back of the boat. The disciples got in the front of the boat. They headed across the Sea of Galilee. And a terrible storm came up just like that, which, as I understand, it's not all that unusual on the Sea of Galilee. Only this storm was worse than usual. The waves are crashing against the bow of the boat. The wind is whistling through the boat. The disciples thought, well, now this is it. We're going to die right here in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And they look in the back of the boat, and there's Jesus, sound asleep. Don't you hate it when someone has the capacity to be completely and utterly calm in the middle of what you are convinced are dire circumstances? Several years ago, I was with my friend, and we were in our kayaks off the coast of Long Island, New York, where I lived at the time. We were in the Great South Bay. It was the middle of November, but it was like 75 degrees, so we didn't wear our wetsuits. And we went out into the bay, and we got caught by a trailing wave that flipped our kayaks over just like that. We had extremely stable kayaks, which meant we couldn't do the Eskimo roll. So once you've gone over, you only have one option, and that's to pull up on the spray skirt and to push yourself out like you're taking off a pair of pants, and then to swim to the surface. And did I mention it was the middle of November? That water was so cold. When I finally got to the surface, I was sure I was going to die. I was scared to death. I'm swimming, and I turn to my friend who looks as calm can be, and I'm flailing my arms, and my friend said, Paula, stand up. Yeah, water's about 3.5 feet deep. So it pulled the kayak behind me, back to the shore. It's a little embarrassing. So what's going on here? The disciples are terrified for their lives. Jesus is sound asleep in the back of the boat. They wake him up, not because they think he really can do anything, but because they're desperate for any kind of help at this point. And Jesus says, oh, you of little faith. And then he says to the storm just 3 words. He says to the storm, quiet, be still. Now, I can say that all day long to my 5 granddaughters. Nothing ever happens. Jesus says it one time to the storm, and the storm just stopped. Imagine that. You're out here in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus speaks 3 words, and the storm just stops. And very quickly, the disciples are probably feeling a little foolish for having said anything to Jesus in the first place, but then it occurs to them. If at first they were terrified of the storm, now they found a second and far more compelling reason to be terrified. Now they're terrified of this man, Jesus. Who is this man that with a few simple words, he can calm a raging storm? I know how they felt about Jesus. They were drawn to him and yet frightened of him all at the same time. Do you ever watch little kids at Christmas time? They can't wait to go see Santa Claus until it's actually time to go see Santa Claus. Then they see this large, formidable figure all dressed in red with a long white beard, and hey, he knows when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. No wonder they cry their eyes out when they have to sit in the old man's lap, right? They're drawn to him, frightened of him, all at the same time. C.S. Lewis had an understanding of these kinds of things. In his Chronicles of Narnia series of books, Aslan the lion is the hero of the books, and he is the savior to the children, but at the same time, hey, he's a lion. And if he wanted to, he could tear them limb from limb. And Lewis was fond of saying throughout all 7 books that Aslan was not a safe lion, you know. And so now the disciples are discovering for the first time Jesus is not a safe Lord. Everything before this time was once before a time. This is when the once upon a time starts. When they realize Jesus is not a safe Lord. Now, when I was a kid, I understood that one way. I saw God as this person who actually kind of hated me and really wanted to send me to hell unless I behaved exactly perfectly, in which case maybe if he wasn't looking, I can sneak into heaven. So if God certainly wasn't safe, God's son wasn't safe either. But that was when I was a child. Now I know God loves me just as I am, no matter what, no change is required. So in what way is Jesus not safe? It's because Jesus always calls us toward our most authentic self. Jesus expects us to believe when Jesus says the truth will set us free, because the truth is, the truth will set us free. The problem is, it generally makes us miserable first. I have a doctorate in pastoral counseling and I have a psychotherapy practice, and people come to me when they're in pain because they want the pain to stop. This is usually why people begin therapy, because they want the pain to stop. But always somewhere in the first 3 or 4 months of therapy, it begins to occur to them that for the pain to stop, they're going to have to work hard, really hard. They're going to have to differentiate from their family of origin. They're going to have to deal with the sexual abuse in their past or the spiritual abuse in their past, which is every bit as ubiquitous. They're going to have a lot of hard work to do, and most people don't want to do it. It's only the brave who remain in therapy. Because the truth is, if you really are willing to trust Jesus, that the truth sets you free, you will go through chaos into emptiness before you find anything resembling peace. Mary Oliver had a sense of this in her poem, Maybe. Sweet Jesus, talking his melancholy madness, stood up in the boat and the sea lay down, silky and sorry. So everybody lived that night. But you know how it is when something different crosses the threshold? The uncles mutter together. The women walk away. The young brother begins to sharpen his knife. Nobody knows what the soul is. It comes and goes like the wind over the water. Sometimes for days you don't think of it. Maybe after the storm, after the multitude was fed, 1 or 2 of them felt the soul slip forth like a tremor of pure sunlight before exhaustion that wants to swallow everything, gripped their bones, and left them, miserable and sleepy as they are now, forgetting how the wind tore at the sails before he rose and spoke to it, tender, luminous, demanding, as he always was, as he always is. 1,000 times more frightening than the killer sea. An important lesson for the disciples to learn in a boat. But there are 2 passages she's referring to in that particular poem. The second is the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus has just fed 5,000 people. They want to make him the new king of Israel. He's not interested in political leadership. He leaves, goes up into the mountains, tells the disciples to go back down and cross the Sea of Galilee. You can see them when they get back to the seaside. They look at the boat, they look at the water. Deja vu sets in. Oh, we do not want to do this. But they're obedient. They set out across the sea, and sure enough, a terrible storm kicks up again. Only this time there's no Jesus sound asleep in the back of the boat. To make matters worse, they look out on the water, and a ghost is walking toward them. The ghost speaks. He says, "Take courage, it is I." Interesting word, courage. I always thought to be courageous meant to step forward without any fear whatsoever. Finally, somewhere along the line, it occurred to me that's not courage, that's stupidity. Courage is stepping forward even though you are terrified in fear. Peter rather courageously thought maybe he'd heard that ghost before. And he said, Lord, if that's you, tell me to walk to you on the water. You can see Jesus. Okay. Walk to me on the water. So Peter gets out of the boat and he walks on the water. You ever done that? I've never done that. I don't know anybody who's ever done that. Actually, I take that back. When I was a kid, I grew up in Akron, Ohio, and we used to go to this church camp called Round Lake Christian Assembly because they had a round lake, and they had a swimming area in the lake, and in the swimming area, they had a floating dock. So one evening, right at dusk, they decided to do a Bible drama, a retelling of this particular story, and they had the best idea. They filled the ballast tanks of that floating dock just enough to bring it right down to water level. So when Jesus was walking on the water, it looked like Jesus was walking on the water. It was so cool. The only problem was Jesus couldn't see where the edge of the dock was. And he fell into the water. And it turned out Jesus didn't swim all that well. So the disciples had to save him from the boat. It kind of ruined the impact of the whole thing. Did the rest of the disciples get out of the boat? No, they're all sitting in the back of the boat. You going to get up? No way, no. The only one with the guts to get out of the boat was Peter. Oh, I know. He took his eyes off Jesus, cried, Lord, save me. That's not the important point. The important point is that he had the guts to get out of the boat and walk on the water in the first place. So I was a very successful CEO of one of the nation's largest church planting organizations. I was the host of a national television show. I taught in 3 different seminaries, 2 in the United States, 1 in Europe. I was the editor-at-large of a large Christian leadership magazine. I preached in megachurches. I was a successful, well-educated, white American male who had no idea how privileged I was. By the way, there's no way a well-educated white American male can understand how much the culture is tilted in his favor. There's no way, because it's all he's ever known. Thomas Merton said it's a difficult thing to come to the top of the ladder of success, only to realize when you get there that your ladder's been leaning against the wrong wall. I knew from the time I was 3 or 4 years of age I was transgender. In my naivete, I thought I got to choose. I thought a gender fairy would arrive and say, okay, the time has come, what will it be? I mean, I knew what I would choose, it's what I was. But alas, no gender fairy arrived, so I just lived my life. Didn't hate being a boy, just knew I wasn't one. Went to college, got married, had kids, built a career, but the call toward authenticity has all the subtlety of a smoke alarm. And eventually decisions have to be made. So I came out as transgender, and I lost every one of my jobs. The church planting organization I'd taken from a budget of $160,000 to a budget of $4 million, from just working in Long Island to working worldwide. 35 years I worked with them. I started when I was 5. Yeah, we're going with that. Yeah, I started when I was 5. Never had a bad review. I was gone in 7 days. I lost all of my jobs within 7 days. In 21 states, you cannot be fired for being transgender. But in all 50, you can be fired if you're transgender and you work for a religious corporation. This is good to know. It was 6 years ago. I was watching my favorite television show of all time, Lost. There came a time in the final season where Jack, the protagonist of the show, comes to realize he's been called by God to die. If you were a Lost fan, it's when Jack and Hurley go to the lighthouse. And I started crying. And I sobbed all the way to dawn. I just wept and wept. And I screamed at God because I knew I'd been called. I screamed, who the do you think you are to call me to this? Don't you know I'm going to lose everything? Don't you know what my family's going to go through? But I knew I'd been called. and you reject the call of God at your own peril. Peter got out of the boat. He walked in the water. An important lesson learned in a boat. But there's one more boat story I want us to talk about. It's the 27th chapter of the book of Acts, the entire chapter. The Apostle Paul was a prisoner. He was going to Rome to appear before Caesar. He'd already been transferred from one ship to another ship. He was in a place called Fair Haven, getting ready to set sail for the harbor at Phoenix. Didn't know there was a harbor in Phoenix, did you? He went to the captain and the owner of the ship, and he begged him not to sail. He said, there are terrible storms in the Adriatic Sea this time of year, but he's a prisoner. Why would they listen to him? They go ahead and set sail, and sure enough, a terrible storm kicks up. Bible tells us it was a nor'easter, hurricane-force winds. There's no way they can make headway against it, so they batten everything down, decide to ride it out. Only they can't ride it out. After 8 days, that storm was still raging. They started throwing cargo overboard, anything to keep the ship afloat. And after 11 days, the Bible tells us all 276 seasoned sailors aboard lost all hope. Then what happened? Paul spoke up. And what did he say? I love it. He said, I told you so. God blessed Paul with many gifts. Apparently tact was not among them. He said, but not a single hair of anybody's head's going to be harmed. Well, the truth is the ship's going to break into 1,000 tiny pieces, but you're all going to live. Well, how do I know? Because an angel has spoken to me. You can imagine the nerve it takes to stand up in front of 276 seasoned sailors, say an angel has spoken to me. And I mean, you can see the sailors, yeah, right. And after the Olympics is over, North and South Korea will be best buddies, right? But they believed him. They were hoping to run the ship aground into an island. It didn't make it. They ran it aground into a sandbar instead. They figured everyone who could swim would swim for the island. Those who couldn't would wait for the ship to break apart, and they would ride the pieces to shore. But one of the sailors said to the captain, hey, we're responsible to Rome for the prisoners? We can't let the prisoners go. We're going to have to kill the prisoners. And the truth is, Paul had to be terrified. Terrified of being a prisoner in the first place and going to appear before Caesar in Rome. Terrified of the storm. He wasn't a seasoned sailor. Terrified of dying at the hands of the seasoned sailors. But when they decide not to kill their prisoners, and they get safely to the island of Malta, a very hostile place, what does Paul do? He risks his life telling the people there about the God whose name is love. You know, in the first part of life, we're busy building resume virtues, We're slaying dragons, amassing fortunes, building kingdoms. And that's fine. But then the time comes that's just not working for us anymore. And we stop working on resume virtues and we start working on eulogy virtues. We stop looking outside ourselves for a sense of who we are. Instead, look deep inside our own souls. We find we have fewer friends, but deeper friendships. We're not nearly as concerned about being right as we are about being in relationship. And we recognize that when we're called, we may have no choice in the matter. At this age, when we know enough to know what the losses are going to be, we might have no choice in the matter. It's called the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell wrote a lot about it. It's common to every culture, every age, every ethnicity, every language group, always has the same elements. An ordinary human being is called on an extraordinary journey onto the road of trials. And initially the person rejects the call because, hey, it's the road of trials. But then a spiritual director comes into his or her life, a Yoda-type person that gives them the courage to accept the call. And they step onto the road of trials, and it's terrible. And then it gets worse. They go into the deep, dark cave, what John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. What Dante was talking about in the Commedia, when he begins, in the middle of the road of my life, I awoke in a dark wood where the true way was wholly lost. You cannot see anything and you're struggling in this dark cave, but that's where you find your strength. And finally, you see the light at the end of the tunnel, and this time it's not an oncoming train. And you find your way back onto the regular, ordinary road of trials because, hey, that's life. And you work your way toward the Holy Grail. And once you find the Holy Grail, your journey is not done yet. You've still got to travel back the road of trials to the place from which you departed and give it as an offering to those from whom you've gone. Then finally, you're free to move on. Now, here's the thing. We're all called onto the road of trials. We're all called onto the hero's journey. You know when it comes. I mean, sometimes you need to stay in the boat. Sometimes you need the safety, you need the peace, you need the comfort, you need the healing. You need to stay in the boat. But then there comes that point where you know you have been called onto the hero's journey. The question is not whether you've been called or not. Everybody's called. The question is, when the call comes, do you answer it or not? So a couple of years ago, I decided it was time to get rid of my kayak. I've lived in Colorado for 10 years, and there's not a whole lot of call for a sea kayak in Colorado. It's just, so I'd left it in New York where I had my apartment, and then I gave up the apartment, and so I decided to give the kayak to my friend who turned over with me. But one last time I wanted to go out on it. So it was a beautiful July evening, and I went in the Great South Bay, and there was a gentle breeze, and it was warm. The wind was gently lapping against the kayak, and I'm watching the sunset behind the Robert Moses Causeway Bridge in the distance, and I was thinking about everything that had happened in the last 2 or 3 years and how awful it was, and it was awful. And I thought, would I do it all again? Would I? And of course, I knew the answer. Of course I would. Because the call toward authenticity is sacred. It is holy. And it's for the greater good. As I sat there watching the sunset, I thought it really is true. Important lessons are learned in both. Will you pray with me? Oh, God, you're not safe. Geez. Except you are safe. Seems like all great truths are paradoxical. You call us onto the hero's journey. And then you give us the strength to trust that the truth will set us free, even though it's likely to make us miserable first. You don't expect us to do it alone, but to do it in community with our tribe, our people. And it's the way you've designed to reconcile the whole creation back to you, the Creator. Why on earth did you trust us to do that? But you did. Give us courage to get out of the boat and walk on the water. And in the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Thank you.